Whispers in the Static. Chapter 1. A Signal from Nowhere. Sophie Darrow first heard the sound on a quiet Sunday evening in her small apartment. She was nestled into her usual spot on the couch, a mug of tea cooling on the side table, the TV casting muted blues across the walls. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the murmur of the newscaster. A crackle, a pop, then like a whisper through clenched teeth. "Help me!" Sophie froze, the ceramic mug halfway to her lips. The sound wasn't coming from the TV. It was coming from her radio. She hadn't turned the radio on in years. It sat on the kitchen counter, an old relic she kept out of nostalgia. And yet there it was, hissing with static. "Help me!" the voice repeated. Her chest tightened. "Who's there?" she called, feeling foolish as the words left her mouth. No reply. The static cut out, leaving only the soft hum of her apartment. Sophie stared at the radio for what felt like an hour before shaking it off. She was overtired, she told herself. Just a glitch. But the sound came back the next night. And the night after that. Chapter 2. The Voice in the Noise. The messages were inconsistent, fractured like pieces of a broken mirror. Sometimes it was a single word, other times a string of garbled phrases. Cold. Alone. They're coming. Sophie started keeping a journal, jotting down every word. The voice was male, young maybe, but distorted, as though the signal had traveled a great distance. She tried to ignore it, even unplugged the radio once, but it didn't matter. The sound would creep through her phone, her laptop, even her television. Always the same voice, always the same plea. "Help me." Chapter 3, A Ghost in the Wires. Determined to get answers, Sophie scoured online forums for explanations. Ghost hunters talked about spirits communicating through electronics. Scientists suggested radio waves could bounce unpredictably, carrying fragments of old broadcasts. Then she found it, a thread about number stations, mysterious, shortwave broadcasts that played eerie sequences of numbers, music, or voices. They were thought to be tied to espionage, remnants of Cold War secrets. Could her voice be one of those? Her heart raced as she typed her story into the forum, asking if anyone had experienced something similar. A reply came almost immediately. "You need to stop listening. They'll notice." Chapter 4. The Static Tightens. Sophie couldn't stop. The voice grew stronger, the messages clearer. They were referenced often, though never identified. "They see me. They know you're listening. Run!" One night, as she replayed the recording for the 100th time, the power in her apartment cut out. She sat in the dark, her pulse hammering in her ears. When the lights flickered back on, her laptop screen was filled with a single message: "Turn it off." Chapter 5. The Neighbor. Sophie's obsession with the voice began to spill into her everyday life. She barely slept, her work suffered, and she stopped seeing friends. It wasn't until her neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Crane, knocked on her door that she realized how far gone she'd become. "You all right, Miss Darrow?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard you talking to someone late at night." Sophie's stomach twisted. I'm just working on a project." Crane hesitated. "Be careful with those radios. You don't always know who's on the other end." Before she could ask what he meant, he shuffled back to his apartment, leaving her staring after him. Chapter 6. How is this possible? That night, the voice returned, more urgent than ever. "Help me. It's close." Sophie leaned in close to the radio. "What's close? Who are you?" The static swirled like a vortex, and then, for the first time, the voice answered clearly. "I'm you." Her breath hitched. The voice continued, calm now, almost pitying. "I've been trying to warn you. You've been listening too long. They've found us." The static grew louder, almost deafening. Sophie's reflection in the darkened TV screen began to warp, her features twisting into a gaunt, hollowed version of herself. And then she saw them. Figures moved behind her in the reflection. their shapes distorted, their limbs unnaturally long. They weren't human. She spun around, but the apartment was empty. "Sophie," the voice whispered, no longer coming from the radio but from somewhere deep inside her head. "Run." Chapter 7. The Signal Ends. By morning, Sophie Darrow was gone. Her apartment was empty, her belongings left untouched, the radio silent. Mr. Crane was the one who called the police. She was a nice girl, he told them, but she was always talking to herself toward the end. They found Sophie's journal sitting open on the kitchen counter. The last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The static isn't noise, it's a door," and something came through. Weeks later, Mr. Crane heard it for himself. A faint whisper crackling through his old radio late at night. "Help me!" He turned the dial, but it didn't stop.